May 18, 1945. Darmstadt, American-occupied Germany. 11:47 a.m. The convoy rolled through streets still smoking from bombardment 3 weeks prior. Sergeant Robert Hayes watched German civilians emerge from rubble like ghosts. Thin, silent, eyes hollow with something beyond hunger. His unit had been briefed. Maintain distance, enforce curfew, distribute rations efficiently. No fraternization. These were the enemy. The women who had built the bombs. The mothers who had sent sons to kill Americans. The hands that had fed the Reich's war machine. Yet when the truck stopped outside the converted munitions factory, now a makeshift detention center for female industrial workers, Hayes saw something that contradicted every poster, every briefing, every certainty he'd carried across the Atlantic. Through the wire fence, 200 women stood in formation, not defiant, not broken, simply waiting. Their clothes were the same gray work uniforms they'd worn when building tank parts. Their faces carried no ideology now, only exhaustion, only the mathematics of survival. The battalion commander gave the order: distribute bread, fresh bread, white flour, American surplus. What happened next would reshape everything Sergeant Hayes believed about victory, about enemies, about the weight of mercy in a conqueror's hands. The American occupation of Germany had been meticulously planned since 1943. Military government handbooks outlined every protocol, denazification procedures, industrial dismantlement schedules, food rationing systems calibrated to prevent starvation while maintaining control. The Psychological Warfare Division had prepared the troops extensively. Germans were not victims. They were collaborators in industrial genocide. The women in these factories had manufactured the weapons that killed American boys at Normandy, at Bastogne, in the Hürtgen forest. Sergeant Hayes had lost his brother at Aachen. Corporal Jimmy Hayes, 22 years old, killed by an 80-meter shell, forged perhaps in a factory just like this one, by hands perhaps similar to those now gripping the wire fence before him. The detention center had once been the Darmstadt Metallwerke, a precision parts manufacturer that had transitioned to tank track assemblies in 1943. American intelligence had identified it as a priority target. RAF bombers had struck it twice. The second raid, in January 1945, had killed 47 workers, mostly Polish and Ukrainian forced laborers, but also German supervisors and machinists. The survivors had continued working until American tanks arrived on March 25, 1945. Now, 6 weeks later, these women existed in a strange limbo. Not quite prisoners of war. They had not worn uniforms or carried weapons. Not quite civilians. They had sustained the Wehrmacht's logistics. They were fed 200 calories daily, the minimum to prevent epidemic disease. They slept on factory floors. They were interrogated, documented, categorized. Some would face tribunals. Most would simply be released when the bureaucracy processed their files. But today, due to a logistic surplus and a battalion commander's discretion, they would receive bread. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb had ordered it almost casually. The field bakery had overproduced. Wastage was inefficient. The women were technically under American responsibility. Feed them, he'd said. Real bread. Show them what civilization looks like. Hayes had heard the subtext. Show them what they lost. Show them what their Führer could never provide. Show them the abundance of American power. But as the tailgate dropped and the smell of fresh-baked bread rolled across the compound, yeast and warmth and impossible softness, Hayes saw something in those 200 faces that his briefings had not prepared him for. Recognition, not of mercy, of something simpler and more devastating. They remembered what bread was supposed to be. The distribution began at noon. MPs opened the gates in sections, allowing 20 women at a time to approach the trucks. Protocol dictated efficiency. 1 loaf per person, no conversation, maintain formation. The process should take 30 minutes. It took 3 hours, because the first woman to receive bread, a woman in her 40s, name tag reading Schaffer E., took the loaf in both hands, felt its weight, its warmth, and simply stood there, frozen, staring at it as though it were a religious object, a relic from a world that had ceased to exist. "Ma'am, you need to move along," Hayes said in his elementary German. She looked up. Her eyes were not grateful. They were not defiant. They were stunned, uncomprehending. "For mich?" she whispered. "For me? Yes. Move along." She clutched the bread to her chest and walked away slowly, reverently, as though afraid sudden movement might make it disappear. The second woman began crying before she even touched the bread. Silent tears, face impassive, as Hayes placed the loaf in her outstretched hands. She did not wipe the tears. She simply held the bread and wept. By the 10th woman, Hayes's hands were shaking slightly. Not from weight. The loaves were light, perhaps a pound each, from the accumulating weight of those faces. The 17th woman kissed the bread before tucking it under her arm. The 23rd collapsed to her knees, requiring assistance from 2 other prisoners. The 31st asked, in broken English, "Why you do this?" Hayes had no answer. Corporal Danny Chen, distributing beside him, muttered, "Jesus Christ, Sarge. When's the last time they ate real bread?" Hayes didn't know. Military intelligence reports indicated Germany's bread rations had deteriorated progressively since 1942. By 1944, civilians received Kriegsbrot, war bread, a dense amalgam of potato flour, sawdust, and ersatz grain that provided calories but little else. The women in this factory had likely eaten it for 3 years. Before that, who knew? Rationing had begun in 1939. 6 years. 6 years since bread had been abundant, white, soft, American. The mythology of the Third Reich had promised strength, purity, triumph. It had delivered sawdust and ash, and now here stood the conquerors, handing out what the 1,000-year Reich could not. Simple flour, properly milled, properly baked, still warm. The contradiction was almost obscene in its simplicity. May 18, 1945, 2:14 p.m., inside the detention barracks. Sergeant Hayes had been ordered to conduct a routine inspection, verify the bread had been distributed properly, ensure no disruptions, document any issues. What he found instead was a silent ceremony. The women had not eaten the bread. In the long barracks hall, they had gathered in small clusters, groups of 5 or 6, seated on floor pallets, the loaves placed before them like offerings. Some clusters prayed, others simply stared. A few women were carefully tearing their loaves into precise portions, counting pieces, whispering calculations. Hayes approached one group. An older woman, perhaps 60, though starvation and exhaustion made age difficult to assess, was dividing her loaf into 8 pieces. She noticed him watching. "For my daughter," she said in careful English, gesturing to a younger woman beside her. "For her children, when we are released, so they can taste. The bread won't last," Hayes said. "It'll be stale tomorrow." The woman smiled, a terrible, knowing smile. They must remember what it was. Before. The word hung like smoke. Hayes moved through the barracks slowly. He saw women wrapping bread portions in scraps of cloth, tucking them into hidden pockets. Others were eating slowly, reverently, making single slices last 20 minutes, chewing each bite with closed eyes, as though memorizing the texture, the taste, the sensation of real food. One young woman, perhaps 19, her work card identified her as Vogel H. Machinist, was writing on a scrap of paper with a stub of pencil. Hayes glimpsed the words, 18, Mai 1945. Sie gaben uns Brot, weiß, weich. Warum? May 18, 1945. They gave us bread, white, soft. Why? Why? The question was spreading through the barracks like contagion, because by the 3rd hour, by the time the last woman had received her loaf, something had shifted. The initial shock had transformed into a kind of cognitive dissonance that Hayes could see physically manifesting. The women were not celebrating. They were not grateful in any simple sense. They were confused. The enemy had fed them better than their own government had in years. The conquerors had shown mercy. Their own leaders had rationed away. The Americans, the degenerates, the mongrels, the subhuman capitalists of Nazi propaganda, had given them bread, real bread, without demand, without ceremony, without ideology, just bread, and in that gesture, the entire architecture of the war's meaning had begun to collapse. May 19, 1945, Battalion Command Post, morning briefing. "We have a problem," Lieutenant Colonel Webb announced to his assembled officers. The bread. Sergeant Hayes, present as Section NCO representative, felt his stomach tighten. Had they violated protocol? Compromised denazification procedures? Intelligence reports the women are treating it as propaganda, but not ours. Theirs. Webb dropped a folder on the table. 2 women requested interrogation sessions voluntarily yesterday evening, not to confess war crimes, to ask questions. Captain Morris, The battalion intelligence officer opened the folder. Subject: Schaefer, Elizabeth, age 47, munitions inspector. Question posed: why was I told Americans would rape and murder us, but instead they give us bread? Subject: Kleinman, Ruth, age 32, assembly supervisor. Question posed: if we were winning the war, why did we eat sawdust while our enemies eat white flour? The room fell silent. It's cognitive breakthrough, Morris continued, his voice clinical but edged with something like awe. These women spent 12 years in a totalitarian information system. They believed the propaganda because it was total, absolute, the only reality they knew. Now they're experiencing massive ideological dissonance, and they're seeking new frameworks to understand their world. Webb lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly. The German command told them we were barbarians. That capture meant death. Some of these women have suicide protocols, cyanide capsules, instructions to resist to the death, but we gave them bread. And that single act contradicts 12 years of Nazi epistemology more effectively than any psychological warfare campaign. Hayes spoke up, hesitant. Sir, are we supposed to be doing this? Doing what, Sergeant? Breaking them psychologically, isn't that? We didn't break them, Morris interrupted. The bread did, or rather their government broke them by lying for 12 years, and we simply revealed the fracture. But Hayes wasn't convinced. He'd seen the faces. The confusion wasn't strategic, it was existential. These women were experiencing a collapse of meaning, not just defeat, but ontological betrayal. Everything they'd been told, everything they'd sacrificed for, everything they'd believed about enemy and ally, strength and weakness, civilization and barbarism, all of it was inverting. Because bread was not complicated, bread was basic, elemental, and the fact that the enemy could provide what the Reich could not wasn't subtle propaganda. It was material reality asserting itself against mythology, and material reality, Hayes was learning, was the most devastating weapon of all. May 20th, 1945, Field Intelligence Unit, Interrogation Transcript, 3472. Subject: Vogel, Helena, age 19, Machinist, Precision Components Division. Interrogator: Captain Morris. Translator: Sergeant Weiss. Duration: 47 minutes. Excerpt begins. Morris: you requested this interview. Why? Vogel: I need to understand something. The bread. Why did you give it to us? Morris: we had surplus. Standard humanitarian protocol. Vogel: no, that's not. Pause, 12 seconds. We were told you would starve us, that Americans execute factory workers, that you are Untermenschen, subhuman, incapable of mercy. Why does the propaganda not match? Morris: German propaganda lied to you. Vogel laughs bitterly. Yes, I am understanding this now. But I need to know. Pause, 8 seconds. How much else was lies? Morris: Miss Vogel, this interview is for intelligence gathering, not. Vogel: then gather this intelligence. Every woman in that camp is asking the same question. If they lied about the bread, what else was false? The Jews, the war aims, the victory they promised? We worked 16-hour shifts. We believed it was for survival, for protecting our families from subhuman invaders. And then the subhuman invaders give us better food than the Reich ever did. So I ask you, how do I know what was real? Morris: pause, 6 seconds. What do you want me to say? Vogel: I want you to tell me if my brother died for lies. He was killed at Kursk, 19 years old. The telegram said he died heroically defending civilization. But if civilization is the side with bread, real bread, white bread, abundance, then what did he defend? Morris: I can't answer that for you. Vogel: no, but you already did. With flour and yeast. You answered everything. Excerpt ends. Captain Morris attached a memo to the transcript. Recommend Psychological Warfare Division review this phenomenon. Subject displays classic symptoms of ideological collapse following material contradiction. She's not resistant. She's seeking new frameworks. Multiply this by 200 women in this facility alone, by thousands across the occupation zone. We're not just occupying Germany. We're occupying their understanding of reality. The bread isn't just food. It's epistemological warfare, and we're winning battles we didn't know we were fighting. The memo reached Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force within 48 hours. By June, American policy would shift, increase rations, accelerate humanitarian aid, broadcast images of abundance. But Sergeant Hayes, reading the transcript in the company office, felt only sadness, because Helena Vogel was right. They had answered everything, and the answer was devastating. May 23, 1945. Detention Facility, dawn. Sergeant Hayes was assigned morning watch when Elizabeth Schaefer approached the wire. She'd been one of the first to receive bread 5 days earlier. Now she stood at the perimeter, hands gripping the fence, waiting patiently until he noticed her. "Sergeant," she called softly. "May I speak?" Hayes approached, wary. Fraternization was still discouraged. Briefly, "I want to tell you something. Not intelligence, a confession. I'm not a priest, ma'am. No, but you are a human, and I need a human to hear this." Her German was slow, deliberate, giving Hayes time to translate in his mind. "When the bread came, I wept. Not from gratitude, from shame." Hayes said nothing. "I have 3 children," Schaefer continued. "My husband was killed in France. My oldest son is in the Hitlerjugend. He was 15 when he was conscripted last November. I do not know if he is alive. My daughters are 9 and 6. They have eaten potato peel soup for 2 years. They have never known abundance. And when I held that bread, your bread, I realized something terrible." She paused, her knuckles white against the wire. "I realized I had stopped believing abundance was possible. I had accepted that scarcity was natural, that hunger was the price of survival, that our leaders were doing their best with limited resources. But you have bread, not rationed, not controlled, not parceled out with cards and quotas. You have bread, which means scarcity was not natural, it was engineered. We were starved deliberately while our leaders promised victory." Hayes felt something tighten in his chest. "Ma'am, do you understand what that means?" Her voice cracked. "It means I normalized my children's hunger. I taught them to accept deprivation as virtue. I fed them propaganda with their potato peels, and I believed it. I believed we were suffering for a greater purpose. But the purpose was a lie, and my children starved for that lie, and I—" She stopped, breathing hard. "I helped build the machines that killed your brother." Hayes froze. "How did you—" "The other sergeant. Chen. He mentioned it, and I want you to know. I am sorry. Not because you defeated us, because I was wrong. About everything." Hayes stared at her. This woman who had fed the Nazi war machine. This woman who had believed the lies. This woman who was now standing before him, stripped of ideology, holding only guilt and comprehension. "I don't forgive you," Hayes said quietly. "I know," Schaefer replied, "but I needed you to know. The bread broke something in me, and I think it was something that needed to break." May 30th, 1945. American Field Kitchen, 1800 hours. The field bakery had become an unexpected center of psychological operations. After the bread distribution incident, Captain Morris had requisitioned additional flour supplies and authorized daily distributions to civilian detention facilities across the sector. The policy was simple: visible abundance. Let them see the logistics. Let them see the waste. Let them see Americans scraping uneaten bread into compost bins while Germans starved for 6 years. It was not cruelty. It was revelation. Master Sergeant Paul Rodriguez oversaw the bakery operations. His crew, 8 men, mostly Italian-American and Jewish soldiers from New York, had been baking continuously since D-Day. They'd fed the army through France, Belgium, Germany. They'd seen starvation, liberation, collapse. But the German distributions affected them differently. "It's fucking surreal, Sarge," Private Levy said, sliding fresh loaves into distribution crates. "My grandparents fled pogroms in Russia, came to America with nothing, and now I'm baking bread to feed Germans who probably cheered when the camps were built. How's that for cosmic justice?" Rodriguez checked the oven temperatures. "You think justice is making them watch us waste food? I think justice is showing them the cost of their choices. They built a war machine. We built a bread machine. Only one of those feeds people." But Rodriguez wasn't sure it was that simple. The previous week, a German woman, a detainee released after denazification clearance, had stopped by the bakery fence. She'd just stood there watching them work. When Rodriguez approached, she'd asked in broken English, "How you make so much? Industrial ovens? Centralized supply chains? Agricultural surplus?" She'd stared at him, uncomprehending. "But how? We had factories. We had organization. We had discipline. How is your bread better?" Rodriguez had realized she genuinely didn't understand. The Reich had taught her that German efficiency was supreme, that American capitalism was wasteful, chaotic, weak, but here was the material proof. American abundance exceeded German productivity by orders of magnitude. Because we don't build weapons first, Rodriguez had told her. We build bread, then weapons. Your government did it backwards. She'd nodded slowly, as though memorizing something important. Then she'd asked, "Can I have employment? I'm Baker." Before war, Rodriguez had taken her information. 3 days later, she was working in the civilian rehabilitation kitchen, teaching American soldiers proper German bread techniques, learning American industrial methods in return. Cultural exchange through flour and yeast. Private Levy called it the most American victory possible. We didn't just beat them, we hired them. Rodriguez called it something else. Proof that pragmatism defeats ideology every time. Because bread doesn't care about race, creed, or national mythology. Bread only cares about being bread. June 7, 1945. Darmstadt Displaced Persons Center. Afternoon, the detention facility had been redesignated. No longer a prisoner compound, it was now a civilian rehabilitation center. The women were being processed for release. Denazification questionnaires, medical examinations, employment screening. Most would return to bombed cities, destroyed homes, families scattered or dead. But first they would be fed. The daily bread distribution had become routine. Except today, something unprecedented happened. A woman approached Sergeant Hayes with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside, 3 pieces of stale bread carefully preserved from the first distribution on May 18th. 20 days old, hard as stone. "For you," she said in halting English. Her name card read, Mueller Anna. Hayes was confused. "Ma'am, we have fresh bread, you don't need to." "No, not for eating, for remembering." She pressed the bundle into his hands. "I keep this bread because it is the day I understand I was living in lies. This bread is more important than food. It is evidence. When my children ask me, when they are older, when they wonder how their mother could believe such things, I will show them this bread, and I will say, this is what the enemy gave me. This is what my government could not. And this is how I learned the difference between propaganda and truth." Hayes held the bundle, unsure what to do. "Why give it to me?" "Because you should know. Your war is not finished. You defeated our army. But the harder war, the war for our minds, that war you are winning now, with bread, and you do not even know you are fighting it." She left before Hayes could respond. That evening, Hayes showed the bread to Captain Morris. "What do I do with this?" Morris studied it for a long moment. "Document it, photograph it, send it to the War Department with a report. Because this," he held up the petrified bread, "this is better intelligence than any interrogation. This woman kept bread for 20 days. In a starvation economy. That's not just gratitude. That's identity reformation. She's building a new personal mythology, and we're the founding story. Is that good? It's necessary. Germany needs new myths. The old ones led to genocide. If bread and mercy become the foundation story of post-war German identity, then maybe, they'll build something different next time." Hayes nodded slowly, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stumbled into something profound by accident. They'd meant to feed bodies. Instead, they'd fed hope. And hope, it turned out, was more dangerous to totalitarianism than any bomb. June 12, 1945. Field Headquarters. Strategic Assessment Meeting. Lieutenant Colonel Webb reviewed the reports accumulating on his desk. 23 detention facilities across the American sector. 18,000 women processed through rehabilitation programs. And everywhere, the same phenomenon. Bread is catalyst for ideological collapse. "We need to scale this," Webb announced. "Not just women, not just factory workers. Every civilian in the American zone needs to see this." Captain Morris raised an eyebrow. "Sir, we're talking about millions of people. The logistics are exactly the point." Webb stood, began pacing. "The Marshall Plan is being drafted right now in Washington. Economic reconstruction for Europe. We're going to rebuild Germany. Not as punishment, but as strategy. Because a Germany that trades with us, that depends on our markets. That sees American abundance as the model for prosperity. That Germany won't start another war. You want to weaponize bread," Morris said slowly. "I want to demonstrate that our system works better than theirs. Their system produced Lebensraum and genocide. Ours produces surplus. That's not propaganda. That's math. Agricultural output per capita. Industrial efficiency. Caloric availability. We win on every metric that actually matters to human survival." Sergeant Hayes, present for logistical consultation, spoke up. Sir, with respect, is this really about helping them? Or is it about proving we're superior? Webb turned, his expression hard. Sergeant, do you know how many American boys died in this war? 400,000. Do you know how many would die if we have to fight Germany again in 20 years? Maybe 1 million, maybe more. So yes, I want to prove we're superior. I want to prove it so thoroughly, so overwhelmingly, that no German citizen ever again believes that authoritarianism and militarism lead to prosperity. I want them fat, comfortable, and dependent on democracy, because that's how you prevent the next Hitler. The room fell silent. The bread isn't mercy, Webb continued, quieter now. It's insurance. Every loaf we distribute, every stomach we fill, every German civilian who says, America gave me this. That's a bullet we don't fire in 1965. That's a son who comes home alive. That's a war we win without fighting. Morris nodded slowly. Cold War calculus. No, Webb corrected. Hot war prevention. We're not containing communism yet. We're containing fascism's ghost, making sure it never resurrects. And the weapon is butter, not guns. Hayes thought about Elizabeth Schaefer, about Helena Vogel, about Anna Muller and her preserved bread. They weren't propaganda targets. They were human beings experiencing the collapse of certainty. But Webb was right about one thing. If that collapse prevented future atrocities, then maybe the exploitation was justified. Maybe. June 19, 1945. Darmstadt Town Square. Liberation of civilian population. The last women were being processed out of the rehabilitation center. Final medical checks, identity papers, ration cards for 60 days. Each received a departure package. Bread, cheese, canned goods, and, unexpectedly, chocolate. American military surplus. 1 bar per person. Sergeant Hayes watched the distribution with Corporal Chen. By now, the initial shock had worn off. The women accepted the food with quiet dignity, thanked the soldiers in broken English, and departed toward whatever remained of their lives. But one young woman, Vogel Helena, the machinist who'd questioned everything, approached Hayes as she prepared to leave. I am going to Berlin, she said, to find my mother. She was there during the bombing. I do not know if she survives. I hope you find her, Hayes replied, sincere despite himself. I want to tell you something. Helena clutched her departure package against her chest. When I first saw your army, I was terrified. We were told you would rape us, execute us, enslave us. I prepared to die. Instead, you gave bread, and chocolate, and medicine, and you asked questions instead of giving orders. Do you understand how confusing this is? Hayes almost smiled. I'm starting to. My entire education taught me that strength comes from domination, that mercy is weakness, that our enemies were animals. But you defeated us, and then you fed us, which means everything I learned was backwards. She paused, eyes intense. I am going to Berlin to tell my mother this, and if she is alive, I will tell my children someday. I will tell them, we were wrong about everything, and the evidence is bread. She left before Hayes could respond. Chen watched her go, then turned to Hayes. You think she'll be okay? Berlin's a nightmare right now, Soviet sector, starvation, violence. I don't know, Hayes admitted, but she's carrying more than bread in that package. She's carrying a different story about what happened here, about who the Americans were. That might matter more than food. You're getting philosophical, Sarge. Yeah, war does that. They continued the distribution in silence, watching 200 women disperse into a shattered nation, each carrying physical sustenance and something less tangible, evidence that the enemy had been human, that the ideology had lied, that reality contradicted mythology. It wasn't victory in any traditional sense, but it was perhaps the beginning of something more important, the possibility that enemies could become something else, not allies, not yet, but people who'd shared bread, and that was enough to build on. July 4th, 1945, Independence Day, American Sector Field Celebration. The battalion marked American independence with a peculiar ceremony. They invited German civilians to the celebration, not as prisoners or subordinates, but as guests. The field kitchen prepared a feast: roasted chicken, corn, potatoes, bread, and apple pie. More food than necessary. Abundance as statement. 50 German women attended, including several from the original bread distribution. They came hesitantly, uncertain of protocol, dressed in their salvaged best. The Americans were boisterous, celebratory, playing baseball and jazz music. The Germans stood apart initially, observing, trying to comprehend this strange conqueror who celebrated by sharing. Lieutenant Colonel Webb gave a brief speech translated by Sergeant Weiss. Today we celebrate freedom, not as Americans, as humans. Freedom from tyranny, freedom from hunger, freedom to build something better than what came before. You were told we were your enemies, we were told you were ours. But enemies are made by governments. Humanity is older than governments. Today we eat together, not because the war is forgotten, but because peace must begin somewhere, and it might as well begin with bread. The Germans applauded politely, uncertainly, but then something unexpected happened. One of the German women, Elizabeth Schaefer, stood and spoke, her voice carrying across the field. You gave us bread when we expected death. You showed us mercy when we deserved judgment. We built machines to kill your sons. You built machines to feed our children. I do not ask forgiveness, that is not mine to request. But I want you to know, you did not just defeat Germany, you defeated our lies. The lies we told ourselves. That cruelty was strength, that hunger was sacrifice, that our enemies were subhuman. You defeated those lies with flour and yeast, with chocolate and kindness, and now we must build something new, without lies. That is harder than surrender, but you have shown us it is possible. She sat down. The Americans were silent, processing. Then slowly, they began applauding, not in victory, in recognition. Sergeant Hayes watched German and American soldiers sharing food, tentative conversations beginning in broken language, laughter emerging carefully like green shoots through bombed earth. This wasn't reconciliation. The wounds were too fresh, the crimes too enormous. But it was, perhaps, the first breath after the long suffocation of ideology. They'd won the war with weapons, but they were winning something else with bread, the possibility that humanity could survive its own worst instincts, if fed properly. August 8, 1945, final deployment briefing. Sergeant Hayes's battalion was rotating out, being redeployed to the Pacific Theater. The war with Japan continued, and American forces were preparing for invasion. Hayes packed his gear slowly, deliberately, knowing this strange chapter was ending. Captain Morris found him in the barracks. Thought you should see this. He handed Hayes a letter. It was from Helena Vogel. She'd found her mother alive in Berlin. They were surviving barely in the Soviet sector. The letter was brief, pragmatic, but at the end a postscript. I told my mother about the bread. She did not believe me at first. She thought I was traumatized, inventing fantasies. So I showed her the chocolate bar I had saved. Just one piece kept for evidence. She held it and wept. Not from hunger, from understanding. She said, "They gave you this?" And I said yes. And she said, "Then we lost more than the war. We lost the truth. That piece of chocolate is worth more than gold now. It is proof that reality contradicts what we were taught. I will keep it until I have children, and I will show them, and I will say, this is what the enemy gave me. This is what mercy looks like. Remember this when leaders speak of enemies in glory. Remember that bread and chocolate matter more than flags." Hayes read it twice, then looked at Morris. "Did we do the right thing?" "I don't know," Morris admitted. "We broke their ideology. But ideologies protect people sometimes, give them meaning, structure, purpose. We took that away. Now they have to build new meaning from rubble. That's harder than fighting, but necessary, maybe. Or maybe we just replaced one dependency with another. German nationalism with American abundance. Either way, they're eating. That counts for something." Hayes folded the letter carefully. "I'm keeping this. Why? Because someday someone's going to ask me what I did in the war, and I'm going to tell them. I handed bread to the enemy, and it changed everything." Morris nodded slowly. "That's one hell of an answer." "Yeah, but it's the truth. We came to conquer. We ended up feeding them, and somehow that was more devastating than any battle. Because you can recover from military defeat, but how do you recover from the realization that your enemies were more human than your leaders? You don't," Morris said quietly. "You just build something different, and hope it's better." September 2nd, 1945, VJ Day, Germany. The war ended. All of it. Japan surrendered. The guns fell silent worldwide. And in occupied Germany, in factories converted to rehabilitation centers, in towns reduced to rubble, in kitchens where German and American cooks worked side by side, a different kind of victory was being consolidated. Not military victory. That had been achieved in May. This was epistemological victory. the reconstruction of reality itself. By September 1945, the American occupation had distributed over 2 million tons of food aid to German civilians. The Marshall Plan was being drafted in Washington, billions of dollars for European reconstruction. The policy was clear: rebuild Germany not as a punishment but as a partner. Make them prosperous. Make them democratic. Make them dependent on trade, law, and mutual interest rather than military conquest. It was, in essence, the bread strategy scaled to continental proportions. And it worked. Sergeant Robert Hayes would return to Ohio, marry, have 3 children, and rarely speak about the war. But in 1973, on his deathbed, he would tell his granddaughter one story about a day in May 1945 when he handed bread to German women and watched certainty collapse in their eyes. "That's when I understood," he'd whisper. "War isn't won by killing. It's won by showing the enemy what they could become if they stopped fighting. We didn't just defeat Germany. We showed them a different future, and they chose it, not because we forced them, because we fed them." Helena Vogel would survive the occupation, marry an American officer, emigrate to New York, and become a professor of European history. She would keep the chocolate bar, now fossilized, inedible, in a glass case in her office. Students would ask about it, and she would tell them, "This is evidence that reality is stronger than propaganda, that material conditions matter more than ideology, that bread and mercy can defeat fascism more permanently than bombs. Remember this, because fascism always returns when people are hungry and afraid, and the answer is always the same: feed them. Not just food, feed them truth, feed them dignity, feed them hope. That's how you kill fascism. You starve it by feeding people." Elizabeth Schaefer would never speak publicly about the war, but every year on May 18th, the anniversary of the bread distribution, she would bake white bread and give it to strangers. When asked why, she would say only, "Because someone once showed me that enemies can be kind, and I never forgot."